Well, we have a lot of material to cover, so in the interest of keeping us on time, the time is now 1:30. I shall begin. Attending this presentation.
I don't have it.
Going to start recording? Yes, we are recording.
No number.
If we could ask you please to mute yourselves as we begin, and there will be portions where we'll ask you to unmute and talk or to utilize the chat as well. Attending this presentation can be used toward prevention certification from ICNRC. And these ATOD hours are a fundamental component of the certification process, offering comprehensive education on substance misuse prevention strategies, intervention techniques, and the intricate dynamics that surround alcohol, tobacco, and other drug use. The hours dedicated to ATOD education equip candidates with an understanding of the diverse facets of substance misuse, preparing them to effectively engage in prevention efforts, advocate for policy changes, and promote healthier communities. So welcome to today's presentation on a critical and evolving facet of contemporary drug landscapes: Xylazine in the area of synthetic street drugs. As our society grapples with the complexities of substance misuse, the emergence of synthetic compounds pose new challenges. And among them, the resurgence of Xylazine demands our attention. So join us as we delve into the pressing issue, exploring the rise of Xylazine, its impact within the realm of synthetic street drugs, the associated risks, and the crucial strategies needed to address its proliferation in our communities. Let's navigate the intricate landscape of synthetic drug trends together and discern how we can effectively tackle this growing concern. This is our acknowledgments. I want to make it clear that the opinions expressed here are the opinions of the PTTC and do not directly reflect any official support or endorsement from DHHS or SAMHSA. And the opinions described in this document are intended for that use only and should not infer that they are supported by SAMHSA or DHHS. Now I have the opportunity and the privilege to introduce our speaker for today. Dr. Montero, a chief postdoctoral research fellow at the HIV Center for Clinical and Behavioral Studies, Columbia University, and a postdoctoral research fellow in the Social Intervention Group for the Healing Community Study, is a distinguished researcher at the forefront of medical and economic anthropology. His groundbreaking work focuses on the intricate intersection of the opioid overdose epidemic, mass incarceration, narcotics supply chains, and public assistance programs for psychiatric disability in the United States. Dr. Montero's mixed methods research illuminates the changing risk environment for HIV, HCV, mental health conditions, and fatal overdoses among the street-based drug users, emphasizing the impact of synthetic sedatives like fentanyl and Xylazine, alongside stimulants such as methamphetamine. His current inquiry into the shift of the opioid overdose epidemic, racial dynamics, now increasingly impacting Black communities, challenges long-standing patterns. Additionally, his long-term ethnographic study of the war on drugs in the Afro-Indigenous region of Mosquita provides invaluable insights into drug control policies in Nicaragua and Honduras. Dr. Montero's comprehensive research is vital in comprehending and addressing the complex dynamics within the substance misuse and public health field.
Should I go ahead?
Our roadmap today is here on the screen for you. We'll provide you an overview of the issues, discuss the impact of xylazine, share with you harm reduction techniques, and especially the role of prevention. We'll provide a summary, and we'll expect each and every one of you to indulge us in completing our evaluation. Without further ado, I give you and put you in the very capable hands of Dr. Fernando Montero.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Derek, for that very generous introduction, and thank you to the team at PTTC and at the University of Oklahoma for organizing this event and inviting me. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here and to speak about this theme to such a diverse group of folks doing incredibly important work in harm reduction and service provision among people who use drugs throughout the United States. So I am a medical anthropologist. I have conducted research on drug economies in the United States, working both with people who sell drugs and with people who use drugs, predominantly in Philadelphia. I lived in the neighborhood of Kensington in Philadelphia between 2008 and 2012 on a block where many of my neighbors sold heroin and cocaine, mostly because they didn't have any other job options, and became very familiar with the landscape of both drug selling and drug use there. And I'm trying to make a case in my program of research for the importance of studying both drug supply and drug use, of bringing together the study of people who use drugs and the study of people who sell drugs, right? And to think of people who sell drugs as people with living experience, who are community stakeholders, who have something to bring to the table in discussions on drug use and changes to drug policy. Most of my research, again, has been in Philadelphia, but I have traveled around the country with various research teams studying transformations in drug supply chains in the United States and how those changes have impacted public health and the health of people who use drugs, right? So I wanted to start by giving you an overview of what we're going to be looking at today. I apologize for that. So we're gonna understand how the sudden expansion of xylazine, fentanyl, and crystal methamphetamine use is related to the history of U.S. drug markets since 1990. We're going to examine how each of these substances relate to one another in the experience of consumption, in their public health impact, including the risk of drug overdose. And we're also going to examine some avenues for public health interventions tailored to this new era of synthetic substances, right? An era where the drug supply everywhere in the United States is increasingly becoming a drug supply that features synthetic drugs, right? We're moving away from agriculturally derived substances like heroin and cocaine towards synthetically produced substances like fentanyl, like xylazine, like crystal methamphetamine, right? This is actually Derek's question, am I right?
Absolutely. We have a poll question to start you out. We just want to test your knowledge right now. And the question is xylazine an opioid? Very simple question. If you could put yes or no on the poll and answer that, then we would be pleased, and it will give us a little foundation to move on. The polls are rolling in. We're looking good today. It looks like we have over 98 people today, almost 200 people. So thank you for participating in this poll right now, and to see those rolling in. It looks like we have 100% have participated in the poll, so we can end the poll now. And Dr. Montero, Fernando, as you prefer to be called, 60% answered no, and 20% answered yes, and you have another 20% that answered not sure.
The answer really is no. But I actually, you know, some studies have been released in the last couple of months that have turned this into a tricky question, because it seems as though xylazine is a kappa opioid agonist, which is not your traditional kind of opioid. Traditional opioids like fentanyl and heroin are primarily mu opioids. They trigger the mu opioid neurotransmitters in the central nervous system. Xylazine is primarily an alpha-2 adrenergic agonist. We're going to get to this in a second, right? But one study in particular revealed over the past month that in rats are different than humans, so we need an asterisk next to all this information, right? But in rats, xylazine appears to be a kappa opioid agonist. Kappa opioid agonists are generally substances that produce dysphoric experiences. So the answer really is, it seems as though it is an opioid, but it's a very different kind of opioid than heroin and fentanyl, right? And this is opening a whole new field for public health investigation, because there's not a significant amount of public health research on kappa opioids. And most of the research in the past few decades has focused on substances like heroin and fentanyl that are mu opioid agonists, right? We're gonna get to some of this in a second during the presentation. To give you an overview of xylazine's pharmacology, xylazine, as I was saying, is an alpha-2 adrenergic agonist. It has long been used in veterinary contexts to treat particularly large animals like horses and cattle. Again, an asterisk around the statement that xylazine is not an opioid for the reasons I stated just now. But it is important to know that it is a synthetic sedative, right? It's a downer, so it's like opioid in that sense, right? It's not a stimulant. I was actually in small rural towns in Puerto Rico in 2009 and 2010, where xylazine first emerged as an opioid adulterant. And it was very interesting to realize that the reason why xylazine emerged there first was that these were horse breeding towns. A lot of the race horses that compete in the mainland United States are bred in rural Puerto Rico. And xylazine has long been used by veterinarians to treat these animals and also to facilitate the transportation of these large horses from the island of Puerto Rico to the US mainland. It is in these little towns that xylazine first emerged, and we haven't really moved very far beyond the public health literature that emerged in those years in the mid to late 2000s in Puerto Rico, when Puerto Rican public health scholars and service providers started trying to understand what the public health impact of xylazine was, right? I will mention more about that in a second. These are some of the bodily effects that xylazine has on humans. Again, we know a lot of this from that initial Puerto Rican public health literature. Xylazine produces deep sedation and a heavy nod within 20 or 30 minutes after consumption. It does slow down the central nervous system. It tends to have an impact on breathing. People begin to breathe a little more slowly. I'll go into detail with respect to that, because one very important thing about xylazine is that it is nowhere close to opioids in relation to its its impact on breathing. We're going to have some more details to share with you about this. It is a very weak respiratory depressant, let's just say that, right? Whereas opioids tend to be strong respiratory depressants. Mu opioids. Xylazine does tend to lower blood pressure. It slows users' heart rate. Amnesia is a significant issue. People, after consuming xylazine, fall into periods of deep sleep, and they won't be able to remember what happened to them leading up to their falling asleep. And a serious concern in the xylazine era is that people who use xylazine develop very severe skin ulcers, right? This is a new variety of skin wound that is really going to be the major public health crisis of the xylazine era, again, for reasons that I will develop later in the presentation. I want to warn you that the next slide contains some very graphic images. illustrating the wounds that people develop in their arms and limbs as a result of xylazine consumption. So those of you who might be a little squeamish, please look away or just be warned that the next slide is going to be very graphic. I wanted to give you an idea of what some of these wounds look like. These are wounds that are actually being treated. I have a friend who is a doctor who sees patients who consume xylazine, and these are wounds from some of the patients that she attends. Xylazine is generally administered in any other way that you consume a powdered substance, right? It can be swallowed, it can be inhaled, it can be snorted, it can be injected, it can be smoked. One of the major transformations that is happening in the country relates to preferences in modes of drug administration, right? For a very long time, during the heroin era in particular, the United States was a country where people tended to inject their drugs, especially the unhoused folks that I work with in my research and that syringe service programs have worked with for decades now. Injection used to be the preferred mode of consumption. This is changing in the fentanyl/xylazine era. The West Coast, as we're going to see, is becoming a heavily smoking part of the country. The East Coast still has a very mixed population, with some people preferring to inject, some people preferring to smoke. Smoking is definitely rising in popularity, but the folks that I work with who are unhoused in Philadelphia and in upstate New York are predominantly injectors.
Dr. Montero, you have one question, and that is, are skin ulcers only seen when injecting?
We're going to get to that. We're going to get to the question of skin wounds. This is a very important question. We have another poll question.
Next poll question we have for all of you is, which of the following effects are not related to xylazine use by humans? Important word being are not related to xylazine use by humans. And the answers are rolling in. Let's get 100% participation again. We have now almost 300 people here, 291. The poll rolls in. We see that the majority of the people have gotten this question correct. I'm going to end the poll now so that we have time and share the results. We have 5% that said the slow breathing, 4% said low blood pressure, 1% said open wounds, and 90% of you got this answer correct. You are paying very close attention. Diarrhea is not one of the related effects. Thank you for participating. As we move forward on our presentation, we want to ask you, what do you know about the prevalence of xylazine in your community? It appears you have a good working knowledge of the side effects and how people are affected, but we want to know, what do you know about the prevalence of xylazine in your community in order to inform us as we continue this presentation? And you can answer this in the chat. Just one thing that you know about the prevalence of xylazine in your community. Okay, got little or nothing. Honestly, I'm unsure. Not much. See an increasing theme around not much. We have someone here from the Albany, New York area, though, and it's extremely common in their area. See it all the time. And confirmed cases in Chicago. It varies from areas of the city. It's being mixed with other drugs. Sharing that. And a lot of not sures and not much. But we have one person that says a 293% increase in xylazine found in fentanyl in Texas now. Interesting. And Mississippi, I don't think it's very common. And not very prevalent in Oklahoma, the OU community. And people are asking for xylazine strips. Interesting. Back on the East Coast again, increased prevalence with fentanyl in Virginia. And
Very interesting.
another participant says naloxone doesn't work with it. So we see a common theme rolling as we have suspected. Over on the East Coast, people are much more familiar with it than here in the South. And that's one of the reasons why we're having this presentation today, because we don't want people to be shocked about this in our area. We want preventionists to be prepared.
Yeah. We'll get to the question of Narcan and Xylazine in a second. I just want to make sure that we follow the order of the slides, and then we'll address questions after I'm done. Okay, so I did want to start by sharing with you a bit about the history of the drug supply in the United States, because it is only by understanding the changes that came before Xylazine that you can really understand why Xylazine emerged at this moment in time and why it has been so successful as an opioid adulterant. So between 1991 and 2013, the story of drug supply in the United States was actually pretty simple. It was pretty easy to tell. There were basically two monopolies in the United States that held consistently for 22 years. It's a very long time for an unregulated market to remain as stable as it did in the United States. The West Coast had exclusively a Mexican form of heroin that was known as black tar. The East Coast had predominantly, or almost exclusively, a form of Colombian heroin that was like an off-white powder that turned brown when mixed with water prior to injection. And there were some Midwestern cities like Chicago where you could find both types of heroin. It turns out epidemiologists found that these small differences in the kinds of heroin that were available in different parts of the country had a huge public health significance. The type of heroin that you had in the West, black tar, was this waxy, gooey, sometimes solid substance that you had to heat in water to dissolve it, to be able to inject it. You, by force, had to use heat and fire. Whereas the powder that we had in the East Coast dissolved very, very easily in water with no need for heat. In fact, in Philadelphia, where I have done research for 15 years now, I have never seen anybody use heat to dissolve their dope in water prior to injection. And epidemiologists found that HCV and HIV rates were significantly higher among people who injected drugs in the East Coast than in the West Coast during this time. Again, because the heat that people who injected drugs in the West Coast needed to use by force to dissolve black tar heroin killed significant amounts of hepatitis C and HIV virus, right? And so the fact that people didn't need to heat their dope in the East Coast was causing people who inject drugs in that part of the country to have higher rates of HIV and HCV than in the West, right? So that's why it really matters to pay attention to these small differences, to these small details in what the supply actually looks like. You can't just say that people are using heroin. You need to know exactly the consistencies, the texture of the substance that people are using, the detail of the composition of that substance, to be able to understand its public health impact, right? If you want to look at the data behind all these claims, you can go to this quote right here, that there's a list of references on the side. The slides are going to be shared with all of you after my presentation. You will see a list of references that includes this very insightful article by Daniel Ciccaroni and Philippe Bourgois, two of my mentors who studied these differences in heroin in different parts of the country in the early 2000s. Beginning in 2013, the story begins to become more complicated. Again, you used to have these two monopolies. It was an easy story to tell. The story begins to get much more intricate in 2013. What happens in 2013 is that there was a shortage of Colombian heroin in the East Coast, and Mexican producers saw an opportunity. They realized that suppliers in the East Coast were having trouble obtaining heroin, and they began to do two things. Mexican producers, for the first time, developed a powdered form of heroin. Again, remember, Mexicans used to only produce black tar. All of a sudden, they began producing powdered heroin, white powder heroin, sending it to the East Coast of the US. And at the same time, they began experimenting with synthetic substances, synthetic opioids like fentanyl. And between 2013 and 2019, what we had in the East Coast of the country was a combination of this new Mexican powder heroin and fentanyl. It took a while for that to happen, for fentanyl to emerge in the West Coast, again, because of the difference in the textures of these substances. Mexican black tar was predominant in the West Coast, and it was almost impossible to adulterate that waxy, gooey, solid substance with fentanyl, which is a powder. And it took a very long time for fentanyl to finally make an impact on the West Coast. And it actually took a complete transformation of the drug supply in the West Coast for fentanyl to finally emerge. And that transformation was the fact that the West Coast became a pill-oriented market. Black tar basically disappeared. There are still some pockets where you can find it. It has mostly disappeared. And what people who are on house who use drugs are doing now are basically pressed fentanyl pills that they crush and smoke. And it was only through that transformation from a black tar market to a pill market that fentanyl was able to make an impact, right? Xylazine entered the stage predominant in Philadelphia, initially in Philadelphia around 2017. By 2020, heroin had basically disappeared from East Coast cities like Philadelphia, and the dope supply there becomes this mix of fentanyl and this new adulterant known as tranq, which is xylazine, right? Sorry. It's interesting that xylazine kind of follows the story of fentanyl in terms of its initial appearance in the East Coast. Again, because the combination of fentanyl and heroin that you had in the East Coast from 2013 to 2019 was a powdered form of dope, right? Xylazine is incorporated into the supply as a powder, and so only a powder really is easy to adulterate with another powder. It's taking a long time for the West Coast to catch up. Xylazine has not yet made a significant impact there. And that has to do, again, with these details in the differences in the different kinds of substances that are available in these regions. One thing that's very interesting in the East Coast is that markets that were formerly dominated by heroin and cocaine all of a sudden begin to see an influx of crystal methamphetamine. In Philadelphia, I never saw methamphetamine when I lived there between 2008 and 2012. Never even heard about it. And when I visited my old neighborhood again right after the COVID moratorium in early 2021, a third of the corners were selling meth, and a lot of the people who use drugs were unhoused, who were formerly only doing heroin and cocaine, were now suddenly doing methamphetamine as well. And we're going to talk a little bit about why meth has found kind of newfound popularity in the East Coast. And as I mentioned, the West Coast around this time, around 2020, is still some research is being done to document when exactly this happened. The West Coast becomes a predominantly pill-oriented market where people are using mostly counterfeit fentanyl pills, crushing them and smoking them, right? So this is, again, this slide is a bit repetitive. It's just to reiterate the point that even the emergence of fentanyl had everything to do with the state of the market before fentanyl emerged, right? You have to understand the changes that came before to understand why a substance emerges at a particular moment in time in a particular place, right? And why it succeeds as a new component of the supply, right? This second point is actually now slightly out of date. It does seem that fentanyl has finally caught up in the West Coast, and fentanyl-related overdoses are almost at the same level now in the West than in the East Coast. Now, there's one thing that I really insist on that will help us to understand the emergence of xylazine, right? Firstly, I'm saying you have to understand fentanyl to understand xylazine. And so this is what really matters when it comes to understanding xylazine about fentanyl. When you hear descriptions of fentanyl, you tend to just hear that fentanyl is more potent than heroin, right? That it is 1,000 to 10,000 times more potent than heroin. I insist that that's actually a very poor description of the difference between heroin and fentanyl. It is true that fentanyl is a more potent respiratory depressant. It has a greater impact on breathing, and this is what causes an opioid overdose, right? I'm sure you all know this, but the way that you die from an opioid overdose is you stop breathing and you die, right? This is very different from a stimulant overdose. Usually substances like cocaine or meth, what they induce is a heart attack or a seizure or a stroke, very different types of overdose. And it is true that fentanyl makes it more likely for a person to die of an overdose than with heroin because fentanyl is such a potent respiratory depressant. But in every other way, in things that have to do with the experience of consumption, from the perspective of somebody who uses drugs on a daily basis, fentanyl is actually an inferior drug. It's worse than heroin. And the ways in which fentanyl is worse than heroin are predominantly, number one, the fact that it lasts so much less. It has a shorter metabolic half-life, and so people get dope sick much more quickly. Withdrawal symptoms appear much more quickly with fentanyl than with heroin. And this has always been a problem of the heroin era from the perspective of people who use drugs on a daily basis, especially for people who are unhoused and who do not have a lot of resources to buy drugs. The fact that they are getting dope sick faster means that they have to buy more, they have to use more, they have to use more frequently, they're reusing syringes more frequently or sharing syringes more frequently. This has always been a problem of the fentanyl era, and there has always been a way in which fentanyl has been seen as being worse than heroin, not better, right? The fact that it is more potent does not mean that it is a better drug, not at all. Another way that fentanyl has long been described as being worse than heroin has to do with the quality of the high. A lot of people have lost the capacity to really distinguish between a heroin high and a fentanyl high because the supply has been a fentanyl supply for so long now that a lot of people don't even have experience with heroin. But in the very initial stages of the fentanyl era, people could very clearly identify that there was a difference in the quality of the high. Heroin was always described as this holistic full body embrace, a very satisfying full body experience. Fentanyl instead was described, again, especially at the beginning when people could really tell the difference. Fentanyl was described as a much more localized high, as concentrated in the neck and the face. Many people described it as a kind of flushing feeling in the face that was not nearly as satisfying as the kind of full body embrace that heroin offered. And so the point of going through these ways in which fentanyl is worse is because it is these deficiencies of fentanyl that opened up the space for xylazine. What xylazine does is that it compensates for all these deficiencies related to fentanyl. I will also make the case that one of the reasons why methamphetamine is becoming popular in parts of the East Coast that never even saw methamphetamine before has everything to do with these deficiencies of fentanyl. So before I spell out exactly what it is about xylazine that compensates for these deficiencies of fentanyl, I wanted to tell you a little bit of how I got involved in this kind of in researching xylazine. Right after the COVID moratorium ended in early 2021, I went back to Philadelphia to visit my old neighbors and talk to people who use drugs there, to see what had happened during COVID, see how COVID had affected the neighborhood and the drug economy there. And that is the first time that I began to hear everybody talking about this new substance in the drug supply, xylazine. or trank, right? Everybody already had all these really sophisticated new slang terms to describe trank and the experience of consuming trank. And so I went back to the public health literature to see if anything had been published about this. Only very little had been reported about it. And so I went back to my research team and I told them, we have to let people know that this is happening. We have to get the word out. And so we started calling jurisdictions across the country, especially medical examiners, to see if they had any data on xylazine's involvement in fatal overdoses. And we were able to get data from 10 different jurisdictions at the time. It was already very clear that between 2015 and 2020, there had been a huge influx of xylazine in every new parts of the country. We were able to show that xylazine involvement in fatal overdoses had risen from 0.36% in 2015 to 6.7% in 2020. Out of the 10 jurisdictions that we were able to get data from, Philadelphia had by far the highest prevalence of xylazine in fatal overdoses. 34.7% of overdose deaths in the city already involved xylazine, followed by the state of Maryland with 19.2% and Connecticut 10.2%. Again, this was the very early stages of kind of getting the word out about xylazine, and so the data we were able to get was actually inconsistent. Sometimes we were able to get data from a city, a local jurisdiction, sometimes only from a state. And so, the data is difficult to compare. But again, we were just interested in getting the word out and letting public health officials and service providers to know that this was happening, right? One important finding already in that initial research was that in Philadelphia, fentanyl was present in 98.4% of xylazine-involved overdose deaths, right? And that was an important finding because it told us that fentanyl and xylazine almost always went hand in hand. You can't really go out to a corner to buy xylazine or trank. What you are buying is dope, and that dope is increasingly, or almost always now, a combination of fentanyl and xylazine, right? Again, you can't really go out to a corner to buy xylazine. Philadelphia actually has a very good drug checking program, and I encourage those of you with the power to do this to start a drug checking program like this in your cities, in your localities, in your towns. It is very important for people who use drugs and for public health officials and service providers to know what the composition of the supply is. It's not enough to know that there is fentanyl where you live or to know that there is xylazine. We need to know exactly the concentration of these substances in the supply. And Philadelphia has a very good program that is showing that the average dope sample in the city, again, you can't even call it the opioid sample anymore, right? You have to call it the dope supply because that's what people refer to it as. And it's increasingly fentanyl and xylazine, right? One which is an opioid and the other which is an alpha-2 adrenergic agonist. Maybe you could speak about the sedative supply, the street sedative supply, but we cannot refer to it as the street opioid supply anymore. And I'm going to be using the word dope to refer to the substance because that is the word that is used in Philadelphia. But so make dope heroin again, that's a good one. So this program in Philadelphia, this drug checking program is showing that the average dope sample there consists of 2 to 10% fentanyl and 30 to 40% xylazine, right? This is huge. It means that xylazine trank is the bulk of the substance that people are using in Philadelphia on an everyday basis, right? There's only a small amount of fentanyl, and the data in Philly is showing that the amount of fentanyl is actually going down in every dope sample as the concentration of xylazine increases. This is the latest data from the DEA on xylazine involvement in fatal overdoses in different regions in the country. This data has to be taken with a huge grain of salt because a lot of jurisdictions are still not testing for xylazine. Different jurisdictions have different protocols for testing. So this data is largely is very inaccurate. These numbers are likely to be much higher in each one of these regions. But in terms of relative magnitude, in terms of the story that they tell about which regions are being most impacted by xylazine, I think the numbers are generally accurate. It is very clear that the Northeast and the South of the United States are being impacted to a much greater extent than the Midwest and the West. The Midwest is catching up quickly. The West, it's going to take a while for the West to catch up. And remember that this is very similar to the story of fentanyl spread. So again, going back to the question of why xylazine and why now, how does xylazine compensate for the deficiencies of fentanyl? This was one of the first conversations I had back in early 2021 with a person who was using dope in Philadelphia every day. That kind of allowed me to understand. I mean, he was teaching me basically what xylazine was doing to the sedative supply in Philadelphia.
This is a statement from an unhoused person who injects drugs in Philadelphia. Fentanyl is such a short-lived high that the high, it's a good high, but it's so short that the nod is over real quick and you get sicker faster. See, the trank extends the high. It gives the dope more of a heroin effect. It's a good rush with the heroin-like legs. But they straight put bags out there that are just all trank. You shoot it, you feel no rush. Trank fent is like you shoot it and you get the rush of the fentanyl. Then the tranquilizer comes in, you nod, and you fall asleep. A straight trank bag is like you shoot it, you get no rush. You're sitting there for a second talking, and then you're waking up 2 or 3 hours later in a weird position. Like one case, I lit a Newport. I shot a bag with a Newport. I woke up with a hole of Newport burnt into my stomach. You could literally drown in a ½ inch of water if you did trank bags and you fell out.
So already at this relatively early stage in the trank era, people like Tom had a very sophisticated sense of the difference between a fentanyl high and a trank high, or a combined trank fent high. There was already a slang term for the combination of xylazine and fentanyl, trank fent. And so notice that the first thing that Tom says is the first thing that he does is complain about the brevity, the quickness of the fentanyl high, right? It's a short-lived high. It's a good high. He's okay with the general character of the high, but it's so short that the nod is over real quick and you get sicker faster. And this is the problem for every unhoused person who uses drugs, right? Dope sickness is a torturous experience. Opioid withdrawal is a form of torture that you don't wish even on your worst enemy. This is what you are trying to avoid first and foremost. And the fact that fentanyl is making you dope sick, torturing you faster than heroin, again, is a huge problem in the fentanyl era. So then the trank extends the high, gives the dope more of the heroin-like legs. Legs is a common term used to describe the duration of the high, right? But then he can also recognizes that there's some problems with trank. Number one, it gives you no rush. This is an important thing to know, right? Xylazine does not produce a rush the way that opioids do. And so people still need fentanyl, not only because they're dependent on opioids, because fentanyl does provide the rush, the rush experience, right? And this is the advantage of the combination of trank and fent. Tom is also letting us know that trank produces new problems, right? You're falling asleep in awkward positions for 2, 3, 4 hours at a time, and all kinds of new dangers emerge as a result of that. You can burn yourself with a cigarette. You can drown in a ½ inch of water. Women in Philadelphia are reporting that they're increasingly worried about sexual assault when they're passed out for extended periods of time in public, in the street, right? So you can already see from this statement, this relatively short statement, all the mixed feelings about this transformation, all the advantages and all the disadvantages, all the problems that xylazine seems to be solving, and all the problems, the new problems that it's creating. So just to spell it out, why xylazine? Why now? Xylazine is compensating for the limits of fentanyl. It's increasing the length of the high. It's bringing back the heroin nod. There's a little bit more of the full body experience that fentanyl had taken away. Remember that fentanyl was described as a more local high. And it's also, of course, solving problems related to supply. Suppliers are also finding it advantageous, right? Firstly, it's very cheap. It's mostly diverted from veterinarians' offices. You can get a vial of Xylazine for $150 in Philadelphia. You put the contents in a microwave. It evaporates and turns into a powder. You can produce 14 grams of Xylazine out of a single vial. And 14 grams is a lot of powder to mix with a tiny little bit of fentanyl, put into bags, and sell it as dope. You're making a lot of money that way. In the long run, it's actually not as profitable as you would think, because remember that Xylazine is also extending the high. And that means that people are buying less again. This is a very important consequence of the Xylazine era, actually. So to a supplier, it looks like you're going to make a lot of money by switching to Xylazine, but in the long term, people are going to buy much less from you. And some of my research in Philadelphia now has to do with the long-term impact of that on the supply side of things. And the story is very messy. It's not like fentanyl, that was kind of a straightforwardly more profitable substance to sell. So Xylazine is going to significantly transform drug markets in a way that does not necessarily work out for suppliers. So,
time for another question. I'm sure all of you were paying attention when Fernando gave you some data earlier, and we asked you now, which region of the U.S. has seen the highest number of Xylazine positive overdose deaths? Which region? Is it the South? Is it the Northeast? Is it the Midwest? Or is it the West? Which region of the U.S. has seen the highest number of Xylazine positive overdoses? And remember, this is from the DEA data that you just saw earlier. Okay, all the answers are rolling in, holding steady with 293 participants. I'm just so happy to see all of you here today and interested in this topic. Hey, in the essence of time, we're going to go ahead and end the poll now. We have about 75% of the people who have participated, and the results are in. 22% said the South, 61% said the Northeast, and 11% said the Midwest, and only 6% said the West. And the correct answer is the South. So you will get a copy of this deck sent to you after the presentation today. It's been in about 10 days. You may want to look over that data again, but the South is the region with the highest number of Xylazine positive overdose. And the South is right where we are as PTTC. We're in the Southwest. Back to you, Fernando.
Yeah, no, I'm actually very curious to hear from those of you who are living in the South, to hear about your experiences. I've never done research there, and I'd be very interested in hearing what you've been seeing, hearing about what you've been seeing there. So, as Tom was saying in that quote that we read out loud, Xylazine has disadvantages that compensate for fentanyl's deficiencies, but it has also introduced, and this is very important to keep in mind, it has also introduced a whole host of new public health complications and challenges. The first, as we mentioned, is that it's not an opioid. So its relationship to Narcan is quite uncertain, right? Even if it is found that Xylazine as a kappa opioid agonist responds to naloxone, we still have the adrenergic 2 agonist to worry about. We still have adrenergic 2 receptors to worry about. And so new reversal agents will need to be invented for humans for those cases in which people consume so much Xylazine that you will need to reverse an overdose using a different substance. In animals, xylazine reversal agents have long been used in veterinary contexts. When you tranquilize a large animal using xylazine to put them into surgery, veterinarians usually end the surgery by reversing xylazine's impact with an adrenergic 2 antagonist. But these have not been sufficiently tested in humans. I'll have more to say about the relationship between naloxone and xylazine in the Q&A, and I really welcome that question. I think we should start with that question after the end of the presentation. In my view, most significant public health challenge of the xylazine era is going to be the skin wound crisis. Xylazine is inducing these new types of skin wounds that are different from traditional heroin abscesses, that are very, very gruesome and are leading all kinds of leading people to lose limbs very frequently. It's also complicating the problem of healthcare access, especially for unhoused people who use drugs, who are already intimidated to go to a hospital to get treatment, but now are increasingly ashamed of showing up at a hospital because of how gruesome and how smelly these skin wounds are. So people who need to get treated for anything, people who need to remain adherent to HIV medications, they're seeing all kinds of complications emerge as a result of the development of these very, very gruesome wounds. As I was mentioning earlier, women especially are reporting an increase in sexual assault as a result of xylazine-induced sleep. Xylazine is causing people to pass out in awkward positions for very long periods of time. This has led to an increase in robbery and muggings and in sexual assault, unfortunately. And then there's questions about xylazine that don't have to do with just the problem of overdose, and it's the question of xylazine withdrawal and detoxification. One of the reasons, I was just in Philadelphia 3 weeks ago talking with unhoused people who use dope, and they were telling me that another reason that they're scared to go to the hospital is not just shame over the wound, it's concern over the fact that their xylazine withdrawal is going to go untreated if they're taken in for the treatment of a skin wound. They know that they'll get something to treat their fentanyl withdrawal. Hospitals have now become very good at this in Philadelphia. But many hospitals don't even know that people are experiencing xylazine withdrawal. And xylazine withdrawal is also a very torturous experience, and it's mostly going unaddressed. I was just recently talking to doctors at Columbia University in the emergency department. They haven't even begun to imagine the concept of xylazine withdrawal. And there is good literature emerging from Philadelphia and from Camden, New Jersey, of doctors who are developing protocols to treat combined xylazine fentanyl withdrawal. And they elaborate case studies very well, showing kind of step by step what medications they use to manage combined fentanyl xylazine withdrawal as they were treating a skin wound. And I'm recommending those articles to every service provider and hospital staff throughout the country, because this is going to become a major public health problem. And in the references here, actually, I list 2 of the articles that have been published by doctors in Philadelphia proposing a new medical protocol for the treatment of xylazine withdrawal, combined fentanyl xylazine withdrawal. So the link between xylazine and fatal overdose is actually has not really been established. In fact, the studies that have been published recently on this subject are suggesting that xylazine is not a significant respiratory depressant. It's not a strong respiratory depressant. Most fatal overdoses today are still fentanyl overdoses, not xylazine overdoses. It appears that xylazine is not contributing significantly to overdoses. In fact, there's a recent article led by Jennifer Love at the University of Pennsylvania that uses data from 9 emergency departments throughout the country to show that patients who are taken in after a non-fatal overdose, who show up positive for xylazine, have lower odds of falling into cardiac arrest or going into a coma than patients who are positive for fentanyl alone. So patients who are showing up positive for xylazine are less likely to die than patients who are only positive for fentanyl. And the hypothesis there, again, this is just a hypothesis. This literature is emerging. This is a new phenomenon. Studies still need to be conducted. There are a lot of clinical research is going to need to happen to really confirm this. But the hypothesis is not that xylazine has any protective effect. The hypothesis is that suppliers who are using xylazine are using less fentanyl. So whoever is using xylazine, the patients that are showing up at the hospital and show up positive for xylazine, is consuming less fentanyl in every bag. And this is having a protective effect with respect to the lethality of overdoses. Again, this is from very robust data from 9 emergency departments throughout the country. This is not my opinion, right? But this will need to be further investigated, right? The jury is still out on this question. But now it is very significant that it is becoming increasingly difficult to distinguish between a potentially fatal overdose and xylazine-induced sleep. When I went to Philly in early 2021, I thought I was seeing overdoses everywhere. I was seeing people pass out on the train platform in a way I had never seen them before. And I thought that I was just witnessing an overdose after an overdose. In fact, I got off the train the first time I saw it to see if I could help a person who I thought was having an overdose. But as soon as I went up to them, I saw them move. And unhoused people who use drugs in Philadelphia are actually complaining that EMTs and paramedics in Philly are a little too trigger happy with the Narcan. They haven't learned to distinguish between xylazine-induced sleep and a potentially fatal overdose. And they're using Narcan on everybody, using these like overkill doses that paramedics use. And they're basically sending everybody into precipitated withdrawal. They're causing people with Narcan to go into withdrawal, which again is dope sickness. It's a torturous experience. Thinking that they're saving everybody's lives, they're actually torturing unhoused people left and right. And I understand the reason why they do it. They're trying to save lives, but in the process, they're alienating their population. Unhoused people in Philly are now scared of paramedics. And this is the opposite of what you want when you're a service provider. So the standard protocols for the provision of care is going to have to change. Paramedics are going to have to develop more sophisticated methods to distinguish between when a person is just passed out from xylazine and when a person is actually dying of an overdose. One thing that service providers are doing in Philadelphia, harm reductionists who really know what they're doing, is carrying a pulse oximeter. This device that lets you find out the level of oxygenation in people's blood. Am I going too slow? With a pulse oximeter, you can determine very quickly whether a person is breathing correctly or not. And in most cases, in xylazine-induced sleep, you'll find that oxygenation levels are above 90. You just need to turn a person around, right? Turn them on their side to clear their airways. Sometimes you might need some rescue breathing for a while. But Narcan is generally unnecessary. And if you do need Narcan, you tend to only need a very diluted dose, not the overkill 8 milligram doses that paramedics are using left and right. This is going to need to become like a major field of public health research. Again, because you have this very difficult dilemma of kind of having to choose between saving a person's life and torturing them and opening up the possibility that you're going to antagonize the populations that you work with, right? Which is itself a public health hazard. You do not want to alienate the people that you work with, right? By torturing them, thinking that you're saving their lives. We can talk a little bit more about this in the Q&A. So now, I did want to talk about a little bit about the emergence of methamphetamine in cities that, in cities where methamphetamine was not popular before, again, because the rise of methamphetamine has everything to do with the deficiencies of fentanyl, with the deficiencies of the previous era of the drug supply. So Derek, if you could help us by reading out these quotes.
In order to keep us on time today, I I will try and summarize them for people, and that is these statements are from unhoused people who use drugs in Philadelphia. And they're cited from Dr. Montero and in his studies. And these statements illustrate crystal methamphetamine's newfound appeal among people who formerly used only opioids in the Rust Belt region. Meth's appeal, like xylazine, derives to a large extent from the deficiencies of fentanyl. In other words, meth is appealing to users because it helps to stave off opioid withdrawal symptoms for a few hours, given fentanyl's short duration of action. In addition, methamphetamine is finding a new appeal among unhoused people who use drugs because in cities like Philadelphia, most unhoused people rely on the nocturnal income-generating activities. Men tend to scrap metal while women predominantly trade sex for money. So methamphetamine allows them to stay up longer in order to work more and to work harder while staving off the opioid fentanyl withdrawal symptoms.
Exactly, yeah. So I'm sorry, I'm going to speed up. But yeah, basically, meth, like xylazine, is staving off withdrawal symptoms for a few hours, at least with the first use of methamphetamine during a single day. It's not like xylazine in that I will indefinitely postpone opioid withdrawal symptoms. It's more limited than that, but that is one of the reasons why meth has found new appeal among people who use opioids in cities like Philadelphia. Now, I did want to quickly discuss what the ultimate public health impact of this new era might be. We do not have sufficient data yet to be able to determine the impact of xylazine combined with fentanyl on levels of rates of HIV and hepatitis C among people who use drugs. But we can hypothesize based on what we know. And it is clear that it's going to be a complicated era with no linear story about rates of infectious disease rising across the board. There's actually a lot of countervailing forces at play right now. So xylazine, interestingly, again, in extending the fentanyl high and staving off withdrawal symptoms, is leading people to use less dope, to inject less frequently throughout the day, to use less frequently throughout the day. And that means reusing syringes less, using syringes less to begin with, right? And that is likely to have a protective effect in relation to HIV and HCV risk. Methamphetamine, on the other hand, has long been strongly correlated to rising rates of HIV and HCV. You have to think about the fact that a lot of unhoused women who are using methamphetamine in cities like Philadelphia are making most of their income through trading sex for money. Methamphetamine is allowing them to work longer hours, which means having more sex for money, and that is very likely to have a negative impact, right? To increase HIV and HCV rates. So you have these kind of countervailing mixed forces, and the story is going to be complicated. Should we move on? Should we just quickly skip this part?
Oh, we're good. Go ahead and bring the poll up. And we want to ask you now, just to test your knowledge as you've been listening today, what's the street name for xylazine? You have trank dope, zombie drug, sleep cut, or all of the above. You can answer that so we can make sure that we understand what this is being called as we start hearing it in our communities. Okay, we have about 66% who've answered the poll, 70% ended. Okay, 42% said trank, 8% said trank dope, 1% said zombie drug, and 50% of you got this correct, and that is all of the above. So any of these could have been what it's called, and it is called all of these as well. Here are the results, and we shall continue on.
All right. So I did want to offer a couple of proposals for how we can or things that can be done in this new era of synthetic substances, right? I am a big proponent of overdose prevention centers. We can talk more about this in the Q&A, but it is very important to keep in mind that overdose prevention centers are not only going to prevent overdoses, right? In the context of xylazine, where people are passing out for extended periods of time, they're also going to help prevent sexual assaults, robbery, muggings, skin wounds that are aggravated by people lying down in the concrete in awkward positions for long periods of time, right? I'm also a big proponent for the democratization of mass spectrometry, right? We need drug checking programs in every locality in the country for people to know on a real-time basis what their drug supply looks like. There's a lot of drug checking programs in the US right now that are basically just trying to kind of hoard data so they can apply to the next NIH grant. We do not need more of those. We do not need more territorial drug checking programs. We need generous drug checking programs that put public health first and foremost at the center. We need programs that will share their data as soon as possible with the public so that people can act accordingly, right? I'm also a big proponent for safe supply. This has been wildly successful in parts of Canada and Western Europe, given the unregulated nature of the supply. That has led to an increase in toxicity and in overdoses. We need programs that prescribe safe opioids to people who are dependent on them. I also think it is very important to engage with people who sell drugs, not only with people who use drugs. It is very important to understand how drug markets are organized, to see how we can produce safe supply from below, right? We do not need big pharma. We do not need big corporations to give us a legal drug market. We already have a drug market that we can potentially change to make it safe for people who use drugs. And, you know, like I lived in a block where most of my neighbors were selling, a lot of my neighbors were selling heroin and cocaine between 2008 and 2012. When I asked them if they'd be willing to store Narcan in their house 2 doors down from the drug corner, they also would say yes, they would have been thrilled to do that. They were never approached by harm reductionists to do that because they were just imagined, dealers are just imagined as these evil figures who are never going to be interested in doing anything related to public health. And that's simply just prejudice, right? It's not fact. We need more engagement with people who sell drugs to see what we can do to distribute Narcan at the right moment, at the right time, to distribute harm reduction technologies at the right moment, at the right time, even to do drug checking programs. And that's it for now. I'm looking forward to your questions. Sorry that I went over the time. Oh, I'm sorry. We got a couple.
Oh, you're absolutely doing well, Dr. Montero. You haven't gone over time. We're just sticking with making sure that we have enough time for questions at the end for you, because we've been flooded in the chat with questions for you. Just
I'm sorry that I have been able
time to get there. So as we move on and start talking about the opportunities for prevention, it's very important for us to understand as preventionists that addressing xylazine misuses requires a multifaceted approach. And I think a lot of you are starting to understand that if you did not come with that understanding today. And that approach encompasses prevention and treatment opportunities. And I also really heard some cutting edge different ways for harm reduction from Dr. Montero as well that we may not have even thought of in this region of the United States yet. But the increased data collection is going to be paramount in enabling a comprehensive understanding of xylazine use patterns and demographics and associated risks is going to make an excellent difference within our region. Because exploring evidence-based practices is crucial. Identifying interventions with proven efficacy can guide prevention strategies and treatment modalities, and advocating for greater access to treatment and detoxification services is another thing that I saw arising from this presentation. And that's going to be essential as well to support individuals struggling with xylazine misuse. Additionally, increasing information and awareness about xylazine, its dangers, and the potential treatment options is vital, and empowering communities to recognize the signs. And I see a lot of you asking questions related to this as well. We have to identify the help in our communities beforehand. We have to educate the help as well, so that when people do seek help, they're getting open doors and they're not facing the stigma that's related to substances. And also, I mean, there has to be more support for prevention efforts, so prevention efforts can be more effective in your communities as we face this challenge. When we're thinking about other potential strategies for prevention, we have to understand the complexity surrounding xylazine and synthetic street drugs. And being here today is one of the biggest steps any of you could take in understanding that as well, because effective prevention strategies are pivotal. One crucial approach involves advocating for increased access to treatment and detoxification facilities. So we're talking again, prevention is here, but we have to work across the whole spectrum. We have to work together in order to solve this problem, and also to prepare for this problem as it starts to spread across the United States. Because providing vital support to individuals so they can navigate substance misuse, if it comes to that point, it's still an important pathway in prevention. Because not only do we want to prevent use and misuse, we also want to prevent deaths. Furthermore, raising awareness and disseminating comprehensive information about the risks and the effects of xylazine are paramount. As we talked about earlier, all the different side effects that are possible from this, the use of this drug, people need to recognize those signs. And it seems especially those first responders need to know what they are, so we're not antagonizing the people who are utilizing the drug and causing a bigger rift and a gap between the service providers and the population that needs help. So leveraging your insights today, and also the insights that we have from successful fentanyl messaging campaigns, can serve as a blueprint. We did the work already when it came to fentanyl, so we have a blueprint within in our tool chest that we can pull upon. We saw that what worked in getting the word out about fentanyl, but we have to draw from those lessons learned so we can tailor targeted awareness initiatives now before it becomes a problem. And by combining these strategies, we aim to fortify prevention efforts, offering support, education, and effective messaging to combat the proliferation and the dangers of xylazine and the other synthetic drugs. With that said, I have a question for you. And that is, and you answer this in the chat, please, but what are some steps that you're taking to address xylazine use in your community right now? What are some steps that you're taking to address this in your community right now? Oh, our slides are doing their own thing. How can we get that to go back? Dr. Fernando, can you help me get that back?
Yeah.
Thank you, sir. And that is, what are some steps we're taking to address xylazine use, and or that you will take if xylazine becomes an issue in your community, since you've been here today and learned this? If you could put that into the chat, either some steps that you're taking already, if you're like on the East Coast or the West Coast, so you can teach those of us who haven't dealt with this problem, or if you've already started to think about some strategies, what will you do if xylazine becomes an issue in your community? And I see training, street outreach, and spread information during locks about the lock zone. Oh, we're just getting flooded. Added raise awareness and PSA campaigns. That's good.
I wanted to answer quickly one of the questions I saw in the chat, because I'm a little worried that what I said can misinform some people or lead to misinterpretation. Xylazine does not help overdoses, right? That's not what I said. Narcan is still very important. Fentanyl overdoses are still a significant concern. Narcan is the one antidote for that. Narcan is still the standard of care. It should be your go-to, especially if you're not very experienced with xylazine. It definitely is your go-to. It's just unclear, because this is a new phenomenon, whether xylazine is contributing to overdoses, right? Xylazine is not helping. It's just not clear whether it's making things worse when it comes to overdoses, right? The rest of the story is more complicated, but I just wanted to make that very clear, because I don't want anybody to think that I'm saying that xylazine is a good thing. No, it's not a good thing.
You, Dr. Fernando, clarifying that. Okay, so I see test strips at the nearby university, especially during prime party times, and also training law enforcement. I will begin to educate about the growing presence of xylazine and the consequences connected. Thank you. And we have also make xylazine test strips available in Nashville already. Street outreach and education awareness test strips. So the message is out about those test strips. And then harm reduction with wound care kits. They are definitely on the cutting edge, Dr. Montero, when it comes to making a plan for how they're going to deal with this topic within their communities. Some other suggestions that we have, of course, is educating your awareness campaigns, train the first responders in your community. It's something that you can do as preventionists as well. You can work with your state to enhance monitoring and reporting, so you can have some good data. Strengthening surveillance systems to track the prevalence and patterns of xylazine use enables you to be proactive and have a response to emerging trends, so you know when this is starting to become a problem before it is a problem. And in collaboration and networking, we all have to work together, establish partnerships between various stakeholders, such as health departments, law enforcement, treatment centers, the community organizations, everyone. And then policy advocacy and making sure that there's access to treatment. There has to be access to treatment available within your communities. And then research and data collection, as well as, when you're taking all this collectively and consistently, you contribute to a more comprehensive approach in addressing the challenges posed by xylazine use within your community. Next slide, please. We have come to our summary. So in today's presentation, we address the concerning rise of xylazine use, recognizing its emergence as a growing issue nationwide. And while its prevalence remains relatively low in many areas outside specific localities, the imperative need for prevention and public health measures proactively prepare and respond cannot be overstated. Drawing on lessons learned from the opioid epidemic, the application of cultural humility and other best practices becomes crucial in addressing this evolving trend. Acting now, armed with insights gained from previous challenges, empowers us to effectively navigate and mitigate the potential worsening of xylazine use. And safeguarding communities is imperative as well. We have to advance our comprehensive prevention efforts. We are now at the question and answer phase. Wanda has put together a lot of your questions, and Dr. Montero is going to answer some questions for you at this time.
Dr. Montero, did you receive those in the chat?
I mean, I did, but
That's okay.
it was a bit difficult. There's a lot of comments, so.
Right. Okay, here we go. So there's a question about how xylazine interacts with other drugs. One specific question was how it interacts with marijuana when smoked.
Wow, okay, so my field of expertise isn't really in marijuana. And I haven't seen any studies on this. My work with people who are unhoused who use drugs is predominantly among people who are combining, dope, which is xylazine and meth, with either cocaine or methamphetamine or crack. So I can tell you a lot about the relationship between tranq and fentanyl and stimulants, but not really about marijuana. The fact that it hasn't emerged as a big issue of public health research likely means that there are not significant public health concerns related to co-use of tranq and weed, but that's an important question, and I think it's a question for service providers to begin to alert us to if it proves to be a challenge. Remember also that people aren't doing just tranq, right? Xylazine is never being consumed alone. What people are using generally is dope, which is a combination of fentanyl and xylazine, right?
Okay, so we had a discussion going on in the chat about the Narcan and doing rescue breathing. And so one of the question is the knuckle to sternum rub not sufficient anymore? And if an overdose victim smokes fentanyl, can a rescuer doing rescue breathing, can they OD also?
No. Remember that people are using fentanyl on an everyday basis, right? People who are dependent on opioids are using fentanyl on an everyday basis. Fentanyl is not like a radioactive substance that kills you instantly if you touch it, right? There's a lot of myths still circulating around that. I can't believe that they're still circulating. People think that they can die by touching fentanyl. That is not the case. You need, again, fentanyl is a very potent respiratory depressant. You have to be careful, but you really have to consume it to suffer the effect, any real danger from it, right? Yeah, and so it is incredibly unlikely for a person conducting rescue breathing to die because a person has residue of fentanyl on their lips. I mean, that you would, if you happen to accidentally consume it in that way, you would be consuming an incredibly microscopic amount that is not likely to even make you feel an effect. No, absolutely not. You should go ahead and do the rescue breathing. Yeah.
Okay. Where do you get test strips and community information access?
Okay, so this generally varies by state. In New York, where I live, in Philadelphia, where I do work, it's very easy to get test strips both for fentanyl and for xylazine. They both exist now. You can get them for free from New York Matters in New York State, or from various state programs in Pennsylvania. They are now generally legal to distribute, but I know that there are some states where they're still considered drug paraphernalia, and you're going to have to consult the current legislation in your state to even determine whether you can legally distribute them or not. Unfortunately, we have some pretty restrictive laws in some states that are still rendering fentanyl strips and xylazine test strips illegal. We definitely have to change that. I think it's very important for these technologies to be distributed as widely as possible.
Thank you. There's just a couple more questions. And maybe you answered this. Were the wounds that we saw, were they because of xylazine being injected?
Oh, that's a great question. This is another issue where it's kind of the data is up in the air. The jury is still out on this. And, I was in Philadelphia 3 weeks ago, and it was very clear that most injectors are suffering the wounds. It takes a while for the wounds to develop. Like, one of the questions that we asked vets almost immediately is, like, are horses developing the wounds if they're being administered Narcan? Turns out they're not, because you need chronic use. So like daily use for extended periods of time for the wounds to develop. So if you use it once in the way that you would, give it to a horse for a surgery, that would not lead to a wound. It really takes chronic use for the wounds to develop. The smokers, that a few people who smoke that smoke dope that I spoke to, interestingly, they didn't have the wounds. they talk about the regular wounds healing more slowly, but I didn't see a smoker who had the full-blown skin wounds that most of the injectors have. I don't want to say, I don't want to make a universal claim from this. This is based on a sample of a few dozen people who use drugs in our own house in Philadelphia. But that was definitely true, 3 weeks ago. And the thing is, I didn't go into this really in the talk. There are several hypotheses for why the wounds are emerging, right? The first is that xylazine is a vasoconstrictor. It restricts the flow of oxygen to your skin. So the tissue dies as a result of lacking oxygen and creates the wound that then gets aggravated. Something that is happening with xylazine is that people get into a sort of vicious cycle, because once the wound develops, you begin to inject. A lot of people begin to inject directly into it. Xylazine is a sedative, so it provides pain relief. And a lot of times people are injecting directly into the wound for the anesthetic effect, and that only aggravates the wound, right? And you enter into this kind of vicious cycle. Also, because xylazine is a vasoconstrictor, restricting blood vessels, constricting blood vessels, people lose access to their veins very quickly, right? They stop having veins that are easily accessible to inject into. So they begin to skimp up or muscle directly into tissue, into muscle more frequently. And wounds become increasingly sort of appealing places to inject, because again, you don't have any veins, so you inject directly into a wound, which is more vascular, where you're going to feel the effect of the substance more quickly.
Thank you. A few more questions.
An important sort of point also is that inhalers are also developing respiratory conditions because of chronic xylazine consumption. The question with smokers is still kind of up in the air. Right? Honestly, I haven't seen it. I don't think we have enough data yet to determine whether people who smoke are consistently developing xylazine wounds.
At this time, Juan, I'm going to ask that we proceed to the next slide and do our evaluation. We will continue to look at these questions, and we'll provide those questions to Dr. Montero, where he can answer the rest of the questions. And when we send out the slide deck to you, then we can provide the answer to those questions to everyone who is registered as well. But your feedback is extremely important to us, so we do want to make sure that we give enough time for this, and that we also finish on time. It's 2:59 now, so if we could put that link in the chat also for the feedback, thank you very much. And if you have a smartphone, you can use this QR code to complete it now on your smartphone, or at least start the process.
I'm about to post a link to an article from Philadelphia that suggests protocols for treating combined xylazine fentanyl withdrawal. Here, this is you can access this one for free, actually.
Okay. With that said, we just want to thank each and every one of you for attending this presentation today, and remind you again that these hours are good for ATOD hours for IC and RC, for your encouraging each of you to, if you are a preventionist, to become a certified preventionist from IC and RC. Xylazine continues to be an emerging challenge, but working together as a society, we can grapple with the complexities of substance misuse and this emergence of synthetic compounds that pose a new challenge among them, because the resurgence of xylazine demands our attention, and that is the purpose of us being here today. Thank you Dr. Fernando Montero for providing us such an enlightening presentation today. We applaud you for the work that you are doing and appreciate you for sharing the time with us today to enlighten us on this topic.
Thank you all. Thanks for the great questions. Thanks for the invitation. It was a pleasure to speak to all of you. Some people are asking for the link to the survey. They're hoping that you could paste it in the chat.
It has been posted again in the chat. And it is likely you should also receive a pop-up once we end the presentation. So if you weren't able to reach the survey link through the link here in the chat or through the QR code, then you'll see it in a pop-up.
Thank you.
Thank you.
For the nice comments also.
Do you have any final words for us, Dr. Montero, before we
Happy holidays. Enjoy the weekend. I hope you all eat a lot.